my time now. All right, so the United States federal government should lift its ban on secondary boycotts. I'm so proud to affirm. Let me know if my Wi-Fi cuts out or if I'm speaking too fast. We're defining secondary boycott as a boycott of an employer with which a union does not have a dispute that is intended to induce the employer to cease doing business with another employer with which the union does not have a dispute. Like an example of a secondary boycott, which is illegal in the status quo, is like the strikers and a cashier at a supermarket decide to strike because of awful working conditions and low pay. If the owners of the supermarket decide not to cave in, they can bring in replacement cashiers or otherwise try to break the picket fence and then try to encourage some workers to return. In the AF world, the union at another company, say another local food supplier, could refuse to deliver food for the supermarket until they meet the workers' demands. So secondary boycotts are currently illegal in the United States federal government under the National Labor Relations Act. Our plan text is just a resolution. We are repealing the section of the National Labor Relations Act that bans secondary boycotts. The actors, the USFG, agent of enforcement is USFG, timeline is immediate, no funding is required. Our framework is that this is a policy round, is demonstrated by the word should. Therefore, our framework in this round will be useful and net benefits because workers compose a significantly larger percentage of the population than managers or those in charge of companies. This is essentially equivalent to the most good for American workers. All right, so now into our case. Our percentage is that it allows unions to leverage their power, thus benefiting the workers. So I already gave the example of the grocery store, but the point is unions can they can boycott employers because of things an employer is doing with another company. Now, what? Okay, so like the example of the supermarket, like the cashiers are striking because of awful work conditions and pay. The owners won't cave in. The replacement cashiers come in, and then like a union of another company can refuse to deliver food. All right. So now what would happen in this instance? Prices would be significantly higher for the supermarket to import food from elsewhere. In the status quo, they're presumably doing what is most profitable for them, which encourages them to cave into the workers' demands. Of course, this is all focused on the example of a supermarket and food producer. It is very easy to see how this can be significantly more extreme. To take the example of Amazon warehouses where workers had to pee in bottles and defecate in bags because they were not allowed time off. Imagine if to go to the bathroom. Imagine if other unions at companies and corporations essentially forced their employers to stop buying from Amazon. The strikes suddenly gained a lot more power. What we essentially see here is that strikes and unions suddenly have a ton more leverage if they can band together, even from entirely different industries. Many corporations rely upon each other, so if unions of these corporations support each other, there's a far greater chance of success. What are the impacts of this? It's pretty clear. In the AF world, more strikes take place because there's a higher chance of them succeeding. More strikes succeed because there's more leverage on the companies, mainly financially, to give into the strike in order to reopen business with other groups that are essentially boycotting them. More successful strikes and unions movements for collective bargaining is clearly a net positive. This means safer work conditions, better pay, etc. More workers able to afford basic necessities and take care of their family / get educated / get healthcare because of increased pay, eventually leading to lives saved. There will also be safer and more comfortable working conditions, as that is one of the main goals of strikes. This is a few things. Firstly, reduces the risk of workplace accidents and fatalities because companies will have to provide more support. It secondly makes it more comfortable. Something like forcing workers to pee in bottles and defecate in bags may not pose an immediate health risk, but it definitely makes the job less enjoyable and reduces quality of life. When you have like unsatisfied workers, it's also bad for the company. So we're also making it better for the company as a whole. What we see here is that the corporations are also benefited by the AF plan. It is a well-accepted fact that happy and satisfied workers are significantly more efficient. A 2019 study from Oxford backed this up, as well as a 2017 study by Forbes. This means that the workers will be more comfortable and happy working, which means more goods produced, which then lower prices for the general population, as well as earning owners money. This is better for all consumers because they get better prices, which means lower, higher quality of life for everyone in the United States of America, especially workers. So a second is that we encourage people to join unions. Our plan indisputably increases union power because they can leverage their power against harmful companies. Workers will see that unions have greater power and therefore join unions to get better benefits, wages, and conditions. For example, workers at a nearby factory will see when going to work that a neighboring grocery store has a picket fence around it and is doing badly because the grocery store did not provide good enough work conditions or pay or benefits. Workers will see the power of a union and join in order to secure a better career for themselves. So what are the impacts here? So point A is personal finances. When people join unions, their job gets better compensation. Union workers make roughly $191 extra per week, which translates to $10,000 extra per year, according to the AFL-CIO. This is 30% extra, according to Union Plus. A 2010, I'll take it at the end of the contention. A 2010 study out of Princeton University found that there's a correlation between happiness and wealth to the point of about $75,000 per year, according to CBS. Most of these people who join unions will go from making $50,000 a year to $60,000 because union members are primarily middle class. Therefore, we are increasing the happiness and quality of life for everyone who joins a union. So point B is health insurance. 92% of workers have job-related health insurance coverage in unions versus 68% of non-union workers, according to Union Plus. Without health insurance, many of these workers could suffer workplace injuries and not get quality medical insurance or will plunge into debt. 65% of people who file for bankruptcy cite medical issues as a key contributor to their financial downfall. Again, money contributes to happiness, and we are saving their lives as well as giving them medical insurance. So point C is pensions. Union workers are more likely to have guaranteed pensions rather than non-union employees, according to Union Plus. Pensions are necessary in order to secure quality of life for the middle class because once they become old. The middle class has difficulty saving money. Overall, saving and improving millions of lives, we outweigh here. Also creates a virtuous cycle. Because people see the union doing good things, they join the union gets more power, the union can do more things. People see the union doing good things, they join the union, you see how it goes. Sorry, I can't take the POI because I have to get through another contention. Our third contention is that we are updating outdated law. In the US, the most important legal document is the Constitution, and the First Amendment of the Constitution explicitly gives American citizens the right to protest. There's no significant distinction between primary and secondary strikes. When a clerk is not being paid enough at a grocery store, that's going to affect everyone. First of all, the clerk is more likely to need welfare assistance, which comes out of everyone's pocket. But more specifically, if the owner of that supermarket is not met with resistance, they will continue to partake in unfair labor practices and abuse their workers. So if you're a delivery driver, if a clerk is being underpaid, then it's only a matter of time before you're underpaid too. When a neighbor's house is on fire, you can't be forced to just look away and hope it doesn't spread. Therefore, to say that secondary strikes are any different from regular strikes is untrue. So the impact of this is that a violation of the Constitution, the document that is most critical to the American legal system. If we violate the Constitution in this regard, we are setting a dangerous precedent for the future. Future generations of Americans could take this violation as a signal to violate the Constitution further, but also laws of all of the United States, because the Constitution is the most respected one. If we don't respect our supreme legal document, the entirety of the legal system in the United States can be in jeopardy. Fortunately, the government solves for this. We can do the right thing by allowing for secondary strikes to take place and protect Americans' rights to protest against fair employers. Allowing secondary strikes to be banned sets a precedent for other strikes to be banned too, because they're essentially the same. And right now, we see this violation of rights in the Constitution in the status quo, like with what's going on with Amazon workers and in other companies. This is going to keep going if we don't repeal this section of the law. So thank you, and I urge you to cut out.
Cool. I'll just be going over neg, ash, and 2 sheets. Cool. Sorry, is everyone ready? Yeah? Okay, then my time starts now. As the first speaker on negation, I'm really proud to negate this resolution that the US federal government should lift its ban on secondary boycotts. And we agree with their top of case, but let's provide some background too. So essentially what's happening right now is that secondary boycotts are put in place by the Taft-Hartley Act, which prohibits unions from using secondary boycotts to reduce the flow of business from suppliers or clients to a company facing a labor dispute. Okay. But we can just use all our top of case. Now let's move on to our first disadvantage, which is of the economy. Uniqueness 1, the economy is recovering. Subpoint A is that 8 in 10 small businesses are at least now partially open. Subpoint B is that the Dow Jones has started to recover from its initial plummet. And subpoint C is that the unemployment rate has significantly decreased from its 14.7% in April, and now it's 7.9%. Okay, the second uniqueness point is that small businesses are on brinks. So subpoint A is that according to recent polls, 1/4 of small businesses are actually on the brink of closure, and subpoint B is that small business confidence has increased, but it's still on the brink. And our link is that, first of all, secondary boycotts itself are really, really bad. And that's because it boycotts neutral third parties that are not involved with an underlying labor dispute. This means that like a small business that simply does business with a company tied up in a labor dispute with a union would be vulnerable to picketing and boycotting by union organizers. And that's why we see that secondary boycotts cause economic damage to neutral small businesses and have the potential to do irreparable harm to their reputations in their local communities. Secondly, we see that secondary boycotts do significant economic harm. Subpoint A is that French companies that were boycotted for the actions of their company had profits fall up to 18%. Subpoint B is that the secondary boycott against Israel failed horribly. And as a result of the secondary boycott, Arab consumers suffered because they didn't have access to the most efficient source of goods and services. Also, we see that Israeli investment also suffered because foreign corporations chose to divert their funding, and eventually this boycott died out and failed. So all of these like bad impacts just happened for no reason. Third link is that secondary boycotts directly harm small businesses. We see that it's because, again, it has secondary activity aimed against the neutral retailers, and typically these are small businesses. And what will happen is that when we like boycott small businesses, people are going to pull out. And yeah, and then the fourth is that it shrinks non-union industries, and that's because there's like increased leverage for labor organizations so that the non-union retail industry in the United States significantly shrinks. And we see that this adds to current unemployment. So just to tie this back to their own grocery example, they try to tell you that like we'll have another company that like removes the flow of groceries to that like grocery store or whatever because of its unfair labor practices. But the fact is that wouldn't happen. What would happen instead is that that supermarket would move their business to another like food supplier or whatever that isn't a small businesses, which is not vulnerable to being boycotted. And in fact, we just see that secondary boycotts wouldn't work. Okay, moving on to our internal links. One, small businesses are key to the economy. According to JP Morgan Chase, small businesses account for nearly 50% of the US's GDP, and they're also making up 64% of new employment in the private sector of the United States.
Why?
Wait, sorry, I don't really have much time. Okay, impacts one is poverty. And that's because when the economy suffers, there's less jobs available. And once there's less jobs, like people are going to be unemployed, obviously. They don't have salaries. Secondly, we see that poverty leads to malnutrition, food insecurity, lack of basic needs, and a decrease in lifespan. Secondly, we see death. We see that unemployment leads to death because families cannot support themselves. And we also see that economic downfall means that there's less resources available, which means that there's resource competition, which raises prices. Also, you can just cross-apply all of their own impacts of their first advantage. Okay, our second disadvantage is trade-off with better activism. This one is that primary boycotts are effective and preferable. Some point A is that, for example, when consumers directly boycotted Nike for their use of child labor, Nike has worked hard not only to rehabilitate its reputation, but to become a sustainability leader. Secondly, is that we see that primary boycotts are actually high in the status quo right now. We see that more and more people are actually joining unions right now, and what unions are doing right now is they're doing primary boycotts. And the reason for all of this is because primary boycotts force these people to actually change their policies. So our link is that one, primary boycotts decrease when secondary boycotts are legalized. And this is because secondary boycotts are way easier because they're directed towards smaller neutral businesses. Think of it this way. Are you going to be able to really boycott like this huge company, Amazon? Probably not, but you can boycott the tiny company that like funds their supplies. And obviously you're going to target that tiny company who literally did nothing wrong except it supplied some random supplies to a horrible company. Why are you going after the small company that did nothing wrong? And so our internal link is, first of all, secondary boycotts don't even work. So point A is that secondary boycotts don't disrupt the process of production for the companies themselves. Secondly, we see that secondary boycotts are also used for political or ideological goals. For example, attempted strikes against Target for supporting a pro-gay rights goals ultimately led the public to rally around Target and hide some of their problematic work policies. And so we would probably see that also, like, since it trades off with like primary boycotts and primary boycotts are better, we're probably going to see less action, and this completely turns their second advantage. So our impact is just less action, which again turns their second advantage. So let's move on to the AF case now. The first thing is about how it allows unions to levy power. Okay, first of all, unions already have power, so like this kind of like entire advantage is already non-unique. But secondly, you can kind of see that their link scenario just doesn't work out, because in the end, if you're going to like boycott a small businesses that is just one link in the chain of like production for some major corrupt corporation, that corporation is not going to just shut down and be like, okay, we give it to your demands. They're just going to like shift suppliers to someone else, and all you're going to see is that you push one random small business out of business, and then you see like this large corporation still being corrupt. They literally do nothing. We see right now in the status quo that primary boycotts are successful. So if you move towards secondary boycotts, we're going to see less attention for primary boycotts that actually have power. And we're going to see that all of these impacts they talk about actually flow neg. Okay, secondly, on the second advantage about how it encourages people to join unions. Okay, cross-apply our second disadvantage, which tells you that people are already joining unions. So this ad is just kind of non-unique. Okay, and then you probably not see this happen anyways, because you're going to see that their secondary boycotts are not even going to work, which is going to disencourage people from joining unions, because they're going to see that instead what it's going to happen is it's going to have horrible ramifications on the economy. You should probably also see that these impacts flow neg. And then thirdly, about how it updates an outdated law. Okay, so this argument about how it violates the Constitution, this has actually been proven multiple times in courts that it does not violate the Constitution. The interpretation of the Constitution is already given to the courts. So like this entire advantage is moot. But even if you don't buy that, like keep in mind that this is the status quo. We have the status, like all of these impacts you're talking about should have happened in the status quo if you're arguing that these happen as a result of violating the Constitution. But clearly, since we don't see any of these horrible impacts you say will happen from violating the Constitution, you probably can't buy that they have any solvency in getting access to their impacts of violating the Constitution. And so overall, Judge, I would urge you a strong vote for the negation team, just because you should probably not buy any of the links for the advantage, and also the snag case is like better warranted. For these reasons, I urge a strong vote for the negation. Thank you.
Great. So just some quick introductions and a roadmap before I begin. My name is Ben Binday. I'm going to be the second speaker for the affirmations debates, speaking in favor of the motion as given. Pronouns are he, him, his. Going to begin with the case that's been introduced by the negation. Time rolling, I'll run back through our case as the aff. Is anyone not ready? Okay, before I get in, if at any point I'm speaking too fast or my Wi-Fi cuts out, let me know. I'll stop time. We can sort something out. So with that being said, I'll then begin my time now. Judges, partner, opposition, for the last 8 minutes, we listened to a lot of rhetoric and a lot of statistics that quite simply misrepresents the issue here and quite simply seems to be a failure to understand the case that my partner provided and that I'm going to build back up throughout this case. So I'm going to begin by starting with this negation case, right? So we get this first contention, which is all about the economy. So we get a bunch of links here, and we basically get a lot of statistics that are not really warranted or tied back to the issue at hand whatsoever. Like, you get a bunch of statistics, we're not really told why this matters. Like, I'll give you one example, but then I'll get into some more of these later. So we're given this idea about like Israel and how the secondary boycott against Israel failed horribly. Firstly, they did not explain whatsoever why this happened. Secondly, they don't really explain how this applies and tie it back to their case. But let's be clear, the vast majority of the issue here in this first contention, in this first dissent that is, and focusing on it, is all about the idea of how the economy is recovering and it's unstable now. And that I think that the negation of this debate seems to have this idea that just because our timeline for this plan is immediate, all of our impacts will be going into will be going in place immediately. That is entirely untrue. If we allow secondary boycotts to take place, not all workers will join a union tomorrow. Not all secondary boycotts will start taking place tomorrow. This is a long process that involves people in industries voting to create unions, voting for union action, things along those lines. That takes several years. At that point, we're going to be pretty much out of the crisis that they continue to talk about. Like, they bring up this idea about how small businesses are on the brink now. Sure, and I'll get more into later why we are not actually hurting small businesses. But even beyond that, by the time that this actually ends up really going into effect and that you see what like the real impacts that we give you in this plan, is going to be a few years down the line, because it's inevitably going to take some time to go into full force. So they can talk all they want about how when we boycott small businesses, people will pull out. But let's be clear, boycotts tend to be against large businesses because large businesses have worse conditions and are more localized, right? The large businesses are the ones with big industries, factories, everything along those lines, because they employ far more people. That essentially means they have to care less about the well-being of their workers because they're more replaceable, and generally the conditions are worse as a result of that, right? You pay lower wages, it's not as local, you don't have to worry as much about reputation because it's a large corporation, everything along those lines. So they say that this ends up shrinking non-union industries and adding to current employment. Let's be clear, research of the union-supported National Employment Law Project estimated the full-year turnover rate at several of Amazon's California warehouses was between 89% and 107%. What we tell you, and what they don't really touch in our case, is that you're going to be seeing turnover and you're going to be seeing less efficient work in these industries because people are going to be less happy there and because they're going to be less satisfied there because the quality of the conditions and everything there is bad. So basically what we see is that bad conditions lead to higher turnover. Companies with bad worker conditions have a lot of turnover and do not have permanent replacements. Happy workers and low turnover is clearly good for small businesses because you can get people there who become more skilled over time, who are happier there, who get relationships with customers as well, and that encourages customers to keep coming back and everything along those lines. So let me touch back on our grocery example for a second, right? So we get the response here that that would not happen. The supermarket would instead move their business to another food supplier that's not a small business. A few things here. Firstly, if they have to move, it will presumably cost them money or otherwise disincentivize them, right? These like supermarkets, grocery stores in the status quo are presumably doing what is the most profitable for them because they're a business and that's what businesses do. They try to put money in the owner's pockets. If they have to pay more to get food from somewhere else or get food delivered from a further location, then that means that is money coming out of the owner's pockets that gives them an incentive to cave into the demands of their workers instead of just trying to fight it off and do otherwise. Even beyond that, they assume that the food supplier is a small business when this is just not true in many cases. As we tell you, small businesses tend to have better conditions than, say, an Amazon or a Target. This is indisputably true. We give you an example of Amazon having bad conditions. They give you an example of Target having bad conditions. They don't give you an example of small businesses because it's quite simply not that common. Thus, the supermarket moves its business from the huge corporation to the small business, if anything, if they do not cave into the union's demands. Also, businesses moving their business to a boycott that is not being boycotted is inherently good because it gives money to good corporations and it incentivizes good worker treatment. Okay, so then you basically get all their internal links and all of their impacts. What I basically tell you is that none of that's going to be taking place because of all of the logic I give you, right? They give this idea that the economy is going to tank because it's fragile in the status quo. That's simply not true. And if you look back at our own case in our first attention, we give you a good amount of warranting for the fact that it actually helps out the economy because you're going to be seeing more efficient stuff, more stuff being produced if there actually is unions, if there is better worker treatment. Let's look at the second contention, right? This idea of a trade-off with better activism. So what you're basically going to see here is that this is entirely non-unique. They bring up this idea that primary boycotts are better. Sure, in no way, shape, or form does the affirmation plan stop primary boycotts from taking place. If anything, it'll take place more in our world because you're going to be seeing more change take place. That means more people realizing they have agency and they have the ability to change stuff. That means more primary boycotts taking place. That means you're going to be seeing more beneficial stuff. Even beyond that, this contention assumes that union boycotts are finite. Union boycotts are not finite. And even if they were, we are not at the limit of boycotts. In the 2010s and 2000s, there were more union boycotts than now. There is space to grow. The percentage of people in the population that have been in unions has been steadily decreasing since I believe the 1960s or something along those lines. The percentage of people in unions used to be around like 60, 70%. Now you'll be lucky if you find 20% in a certain industry that are in a union. So the fact of the matter is, if boycotts are not worth it for the union will not boycott. Unions want to succeed. They will do what is best for them. They will not put a place out of business if they know it will end up hurting them as a result. Unions are not like these people who are like, bad conditions, strike no matter what. No, they obviously look at both sides of the issue. They look at whether it will be beneficial. They make a decision based on that. Then they say, well, you'll be able to boycott huge companies. Probably not. That's entirely not true. You can boycott or strike and say one certain warehouse. Look at what happened in Amazon in Alabama recently, although obviously that vote to unionize failed. The fact of the matter is certain warehouses and workers in warehouses can strike as a result. You can see smaller sectors of the industry striking as a result. And even if you want to look back into the past, there are like railroad industries that had hundreds of thousands of workers that ended up organizing large-scale strikes around that. Like whole states of teachers, I believe West Virginia and Oklahoma in the last 5 years alone, every single teacher in those states has gone on strike. Those are very clearly easy to organize. Okay, let's move back onto the AF case. And what you're going to see is there's really not that much I have to build back up because the vast majority of our case was untouched or misrepresented, right? Let's look at our first contention, the idea that we're allowing unions to leverage their power and benefiting the workers. We give you a ton of analysis here. We give you a ton of impacts. Extend those through, but the fact of the matter is the vast majority of these are not touched. The response that we get is that the unions already have power, but this is not unique. Let's be clear. It is not yes, you have power, or no, you don't have power. This is a spectrum. It is a scale. It's not a yes or no thing. Like clearly unions can have more power, they can have more leverage, they can do more stuff in the future. They also state these links do not work. If you boycott a small business, that's just one link in the chain and they'll shift a supplier to elsewhere. Let's look at this. You boycott a small business or corporation, they'll shift their supplier to elsewhere, which probably costs them more because they are working with you because you are the best deal for them. It is costly for businesses to switch suppliers, so businesses are disincentivized for having bad conditions and being boycotted. They also state the primary boycotts instead are successful in the status quo. We are not getting rid of primary boycotts. Extend the vast majority of this analysis through, judges. Okay, second contention, the idea of encouraging people to join unions. We give you a lot of analysis here. Once again, these unions are going to be more successful. There's going to be more publicity surrounding them. Unions are clearly beneficial. We give you a ton of reasoning for this, and it encourages more people to join unions, right? The response that we get is that we should cross-apply their second contention. People are already joining unions. Let's be clear. If people are joining unions in the status quo, more people can join unions. That's not something that's a yes or no. That's once again a scalar thing. There's a difference between some people joining a union and many people joining a union. Even beyond that, more people are not joining unions in the status quo. Union membership has been steadily decreasing since the middle of the 1900s. Then like they say that secondary boycotts will not work, but they claim this and they only give you an example of say Israel doing badly. They show you that in Israel there were secondary boycotts and then the economy worsened. That's two events happening at the same time. They've not proved causation. This third contention, they basically say that this has been proved otherwise many times in court. Let's be clear, the impacts are happening right now. If you look at Amazon and in Alabama, unions do not have the power to stand up because they don't have secondary boycotts. We need secondary boycotts to save the workers. Fact of the matter is, we understand courts have ruled that it's legal. It can be legal and still bad. We say that it makes it easier for more actions that are anti-worker in the future. This isn't really touched. So thank you, judges. I strongly encourage an affirmation ballot.
Hi, my name is Kira. I will be the second negation speaker. I'm just going to set up a timer and then we'll get started. Just going to go over our case and theirs. Okay. 8 minutes. Is anybody not ready?
Is anyone there?
Or something that they disagree with,
Wait,
then they can.
stop. You cut out.
Oh.
From the beginning. Can you hear me? Hello? Hello? Hello?
My time starts now. Let's go to our econ disadvantage. Basically, what secondary boycotts do is that when there are a bunch of people part of a union who are facing some like institution that is imposing things that they do not appreciate, then they can go to a side company, a neutral actor in the situation who is somehow associated with this business and essentially boycott them. That is what changing this law to allow secondary boycotts does. In their example about this, the grocery store, I think they've misinterpreted this entirely. The people who are subject to the conditions of the grocery store and are upset with the employers, what they can do is that they can boycott the supplier chain. This means that the supplier chain, the people who are like involved in actually like supporting this business or are somehow tied to this business are the ones who are impacted. It's not the employers themselves. Maybe the employers will have to like change their suppliers or something, but who it really ends up impacting is this other side business. These big employers are normally these big corporations. They can change their resources. They can adapt to the situation. They are not going to be significant.
POI,
Yes.
what do you sell if you don't have suppliers?
I'm saying that they're going to change suppliers. Like there's not a finite amount. Like there's always going to be more supply chains. Yeah, all it just ends up doing is hurting these supply chain businesses who support them, or even like not even supply chain businesses, other businesses who are associated with this company. It could just be those who have entered a partnership with this company. They can be boycotted. So like they're being benefited from this relationship, but now they have to cut off ties because they are associated with it and they are now being boycotted, even though they are not actually participating in any of the situation that is at hand. So what we're going to be seeing is that this has a direct impact on the economy. I think the thesis of our disadvantage is pretty straightforward. The economy is on the brink right now. Sure, they say that it will not happen tomorrow, but by allowing their secondary boycotts to open up immediately, we're seeing that there's a lot of unions who are willing to strike. They give you all these warrants about how unions can organize very effectively and efficiently. So I don't see why secondary boycotts would not be like implemented as soon as possible. We're also going to be seeing that the economy also recovers slowly. So as the economy recovers, we really need to have support for these businesses, for these small businesses who are not in like a great position right now, who are not like these big supply chains who have all the money in the world. These are the businesses who are at risk here, who they are putting furthermore at risk. I'm sorry, I'm going to get to the bottom of this and then maybe I'll take it. This has a couple of implications. Firstly, we're going to be seeing that they do not solve for any of their impacts. Usually the industries who are just simply tied to this by some sort of like tie or like partnership do not actually have like a significant importance to the actions that are being taken. We see that these big supply chains are the ones that are not going to be like significantly impacted. Like these big industries, they don't actually get impacted. The small businesses who have small ties to them, these are who get impacted.
Secondly, we're going to be seeing that this is going to destroy the economy and destroy the chance for economic growth, because at the point where these small businesses who are associated with these big corporations can just be thrust under like the entirety of the brunt of like economic sanctions and boycotts, we're going to be seeing that these it causes their economy to shrink significantly. This is why all of our examples tie in, ones about like the French companies being sanctioned for their government's involvement in something else. They don't have a choice in what their government does. They don't have a choice in what happens there, but they are being impacted significantly. Their profits declined 18%, and guess what? The government did not change their actions. Fundamentally, the big institutions implementing these policies that people disagree with don't change. That is what the warrants show. That is what the historical data shows. All it does is impact the small businesses, the businesses tied to this that have to end up closing. Furthermore, we see that it deters investment as well, which is another link that has gone entirely untouched. Just extend the example of Israel, where businesses were deterred from engaging in any business with that country or the corporations in it at all because they knew that there were boycotts associated with it and there was more profit in other places. That meant that the economy suffered significantly and consumers couldn't get access to necessary products or get access to more efficient goods and services, which ends up lowering prices. This means that in the end, these people are negatively impacted by the impacts of secondary boycotts, which ends up hurting consumers even more. Is an independent reason as to why unions, although they may be strengthened now and maybe they can provide some good benefits, the consumers will end up being harmed. The small businesses will end up being harmed. And in the end, the economy will suffer. And that is a big reason why you cannot vote for the affirmative in today's world, because we're seeing that their plan neither resolves any of the issues of boycotting, nor does it actually lead to any economic growth at the point where it's literally shutting down the basis for the economy, which is small businesses and investment. Then let's go to our second disadvantage. We're just going to be extending this as a turn to the affirmative, not as an independent disadvantage, I guess. I guess it's still a voting issue, but go to our second disadvantage. They see that there's no trade-off and the plan doesn't stop boycotts in any way. We're going to be seeing that, yes, there is trade-off. There is a finite number of resources that unions have. Unions cannot just invest everything and boycott absolutely everything. That is not going to be able to resolve. We're going to see that the reason why they choose to do secondary boycotts over primary boycotts is the reason my partner explained, because they're easier, because these small companies are easier to target, are easier to boycott than these big industries. But who ends up getting impacted? These small companies a lot more. But we see that primary boycotts are much more effective. Extend our example about Nike actually instituting reforms after a primary boycott was implemented. I'm also going to be extending our warrants about union rates increasing already in the status quo to show how their advantages are not. We're going to be seeing that overall there's less activism, less focused activism under the world of the affirmative because it takes power away from primary boycotts. Now let's go to the affirmatives case. Firstly, basically an overview to the entire case. They say that this is going to improve unions. This is going to lead to a better quality of life, but it is never worth it to allow these select individuals who are in unions to have better wages at the sacrifice of all of these other workers who cannot afford the dues to get into unions in the first place. And yes, unions do have high fees to get into them, which means that some workers are always going to be excluded. We're also going to be seeing that the rest of the economy being sacrificed for a couple of union workers is never going to be worth the trade-off, even if you buy that unions are going to be benefited by this. Their big advantage on leveraging power. Let's go there. They say that the unions have power, but we see that unions have power in the status quo because they have primary boycotts as a tool. They have fundamentally conceded that primary boycotts are very successful, which means that you have no reason to vote for them at the point where they don't give you a reason why secondary boycotts are necessary to add on to this at the point where primary boycotts can be utilized effectively. Their big issue here is that they give you this example about Alabama not voting to actually institute reforms. We're seeing that that's the problem with the union itself. That's an issue within the union. The union could have chosen to institute reforms. They decided not to. They decided to not continue that boycott. We're seeing that the reason why they don't see this big change is not because of unions not having power. They do have power. The vote in Alabama itself proves that the union had the choice and chose not to take its action. We're also going to see that all of their things are about more strikes taking places and higher chances to succeeding. It doesn't matter if you have more strikes if the strikes you do have don't work, which is why we're seeing that fundamentally primary strikes are going to be better. We're also going to see that workers are more satisfied when they actually have a job, which means that if workers are out of work because these small companies are being shut down, as we've seen through historical precedent, it's going to be worse overall. Then on their second advantage, extend that people are already joining unions. They say more people can join unions, but that's not like true. Also, all of their impacts are correlation, not causation, whereas ours are clearly causation. We're seeing that destroying union industries for the benefit of the people who can't afford to pay union fees is very bad, and that secondary boycotts are very clearly not effective, and that the damages to the economy are going to be much worse, and constitutionality is already going to be proved already. So for all those reasons, I strongly urge a negative vote. Thank you. Cool.
Hi, sorry, I have a question before you start your speech. Can you send the link to the Israel source in the chat?
Yeah, just a second, let me find it.
Thank you.
I'm pretty sure that's it. I might have gone the wrong one, but I think it should be in there.
Cool. Are we ready to go? Yeah. Okay. Cool. Then I have 4 minutes. Is everyone ready? Yeah. Okay. Cool. Oh, okay. Okay. I'm okay. Cool. Then my time starts now. Overall, Judge, you should vote for the negation this round at the point where we prove that secondary boycotts are unnecessary and ineffective, and we also prove that the entire economy should probably be preferred over a few union workers. So first, obviously, economy outweighs any of the asked impacts, because all of the asked impacts, first of all, only impact union workers, who are basically people who can afford to pay the fees to be in the union. Also, the economy probably outweighs, because we see that poverty and unemployment, all of these are literally terminal impacts that lead to death. That's probably going to be the highest magnitude impact in this entire round. So regardless if you're voting on magnitude or scope, you should be voting for the negation already. Secondly, we see that our entire argument essentially turns the AF case. We see that we're going to see that when we legalize secondary boycotts, people are going to prefer secondary boycotts because small businesses are a preferable target because, again, they're small. It's easier to boycott something that's super small because they don't have the resources to fight back against you. And we see that secondary boycotts are ineffective because while they're very, very effective at shutting down these small businesses, they're ineffective at doing anything to the big company like Amazon or whatever, because they have the resources to go and choose another retailer. Again, as my partner said, there's always going to be another supplier there. And even if there isn't, secondary boycotts literally extend to all businesses that are associated with the target business. That's going to be horrible. Imagine it's just some business that sells some random thing on Amazon that gets boycotted and their entire family it becomes poor because of it. Obviously this does nothing to Amazon, but it's horrible for that small business. And so we're probably going to see that an increase in secondary boycotts will not only divert attention away from these primary boycotts, but they're also not going to be proved to be very effective at all. That means you'd probably turn all of the AF case regarding how more strikes take place and there's more success and there's going to be more people who are happy and stuff, because none of this is going to happen because you're taking attention away from the primary boycotts that are happening in the status quo and are already successful. Even if you don't buy that, just the sheer fact that primary boycotts in the status quo are successful kind of proves that there is no need without the resources to join unions into poverty and death. It's probably going to be preferable to prefer the entire US economy over a few unions. Okay, now I'm going to go into preempts. So firstly, they're probably going to say that we're not taking action immediately, but their entire case is about how unions are super effective, unions are great, blah, blah, blah. Choose one or the other. They're not going to take action immediately. You should probably buy unions aren't that great either if they can't even take action that fast. Secondly, they talk about how unions are good. Yes, unions are good, and you're limiting their power if you're diverting them to ineffective boycotts. Thirdly, they say it costs money to switch suppliers. At a time like this really, really competitive market, there's always going to be suppliers. And that little bit of money that it might cost to switch suppliers will probably not outweigh the amount of money it would take for an entire company to change their labor practices. Then they talk about how boycotts are not finite, so it wouldn't outweigh primary boycotts. But the thing is, it kind of is. You can't boycott every single thing in the world, then you're not going to have anything left. And then finally, you say that it's good for econ productivity. That's probably not true. If you're pushing the entire econ into unemployment and poverty, you're not going to have any productivity if no one has jobs and all small businesses are destroyed. So overall, Judge, just again, cross-apply all of our warrants. We tell you 64% of jobs are from small businesses. Cross-apply the rest of our warrants by the fact that the negation actually has access to the entire economy, while the affirmation only has access to unions, which is a good reason you should vote for the negation in this round. Thank you.
Okay. All right. So with this speech, what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna give some clarifications, and then I will be going into 3 separate voter issues. So yeah, that's about it. Yeah. Okay. All right, I will begin my time. Oh, and before I start, let me know if I cut out if I'm speaking too fast. I'll start my time now. Judges, I'm not sure what the negation has been responding to for the last 13 minutes, but I can guarantee you it's not the case I introduced in the PMC speech. Allow me to begin with some clarifications. There are a couple of them, and then move into some voters. We get this new neg arg in the block about how they outweigh and we are bad because we only affect union workers, and many people cannot afford union dues. A few things. Union dues are an average of $200 a year, and the average increase of wages due to unions is over $2,000. Also, anyone who wants to opt out of, this is a clear, a bigger comparison, $500 a year versus $2,000 a year, that's 4 times as much, and net benefit of $1,500, that's a big deal. Also, anyone who wants to opt out of union dues can do it and still get the benefits. This applies to everyone. We also tell you that more unions will be created at different businesses, which helps more people. On the first dissad from OB, we're told that it only affects the supply chain, but there's a small bit. Which is a small business? No, because firstly, large corporations usually offer cheaper prices. Then being pushed away means more people will be using small businesses. Secondly, we tell you that it can affect large businesses. If an Amazon warehouse suddenly off all their workers, I'm sure they would rather get resources from elsewhere than keep pushing for their workers to have to go to the bathroom in bottles and on the working floor. Our first advantage is responded to because we say secondary boycotts will be chosen instead of primary because they are easier. These will happen at the same time. You maximize leverage. They don't understand this concept. The point is they tell you secondary are strong, or for primary are stronger than secondary, but we tell you that either way it's increasing union power. If the unions decide that secondary is worse for them, they won't do them, and then we'll just be where we started and there'll have been no net change. But what will probably happen, which is what we tell you in our case, is that they'll see that secondary strikes are beneficial, and so they will use both, increasing their power. They don't really touch most of our first, second, and third contentions, so flow them through. So they also tell you that unions will do secondary boycotts against small businesses. That's not true. So here's what's key here. Unions do what's best for them. This is something that's very key to understanding a lot of this debate. So this is key because unions do what's best for them. They're not going to do things that prioritize bad activism. Like their second contention as a result of this is invalid and it pushes forward our first instead of their second. Additionally, if secondary boycotts actually led to the failure of small businesses, unions would not do secondary boycotts because it would cost their workers and lose their jobs. Like unions like want to work against businesses, sure, but not to the point where the workers are going to lose their jobs. So the unions want to work with the small businesses. They're going to go against the big businesses who have the resources to pay workers more and still not go bankrupt. All right, vote issue 1. What exactly are we incentivizing / disincentivizing? They tell you that our links don't work, but I think they misrepresent the complexity of the link chain. They tell you people switch suppliers, no big deal, nothing happens. They tell you our links don't work because if you boycott a small business, that is just one link in the chain, they will shift a supplier to elsewhere. They essentially tell you that our links and impacts don't matter because businesses will just switch supplier. Let's look at this. Let's look at an example. A company, let's call it Zoark, has bad pay, makes their workers go to the bathroom on the work floor and has no benefits. The Zoark workers happen to be part of a union. The workers at Zoark's supplier are also part of the same union. Under our plan, the union workers are allowed to boycott Zoark and Zoark's supplier. Zoark's supplier will then cut off ties with Zoark in order to stop being boycotted. Now Zoark has to find a new supplier. In the meantime, before they find a supplier, Zoark loses a lot of money because they don't have product and businesses deals takes a while. Zoark is losing millions of money per day because they don't have a supplier. Zoark finds a new supplier, but it's more expensive because Zoark's previous deal was the best deal they could find. So Zoark lost millions, maybe billions of dollars because they treated their workers badly. Businesses will see what happened with Zoark, and Zoark sees what happened, and they'll start treating their workers better, which is a bright line to all the impacts of our first and second contention. So extend those. Voter issue 2, what is best for the workers? In voter issue 1, I give you a long link chain to explain why our plan is good for workers, but on top of that, the following is indisputable. The plan gives more power to unions. Unions do good things, as I've explained many times. Our opponents and I agree that primary strikes are successful. More power to something that does good is beneficial. Also, more people join unions in our world. They tell you that our impacts are all correlation. That's not true. Someone's walking down the street, they say it's pick and strike. Like they are at a bad job, they're at Amazon, and they see like people down the street are on strike, standing up for what they believe in. They're gonna want to join a union too because they like feel empathy and they want to do the same thing. They don't engage with our third contention. We tell you it's easier for more anti-worker laws to be passed in the future in the op world. Constitutionality was not this whole argument, so we're benefiting workers in the long term too. All right, so let's look at what's best for the companies. Their offense here is in Israel after the secondary boycotts were instituted, the economy got worse. They don't tell you how this happens. They tell you like these two things. That's correlation, not causation. Like the point is they don't tell you this happened, then this happened, then this happened. They just tell you they had secondary boycott laws and then Israel's economy got worse. Those could have been two completely random things, whereas we give you entire link chains. Also, like Amazon has high turnover, that's bad. Bad conditions lead to high turnover, whereas like worker happiness and low turnover lead to a good company. Israel's economy has consistently gone up since then too, so I don't know where the argument is based. So vote for us because we help. They also don't touch our first intention, the impacts, and more efficiency and less turnover conditions are better. So vote for us because we have a better link chain, we do better for workers and do better for corporations. Thank you, and I urge you to go out.
Good round, you guys. That was a lot of fun.
Well, we both made the decision. Do you want to go first, Alejandra?
Sure. Yeah, I see on tab room that we have a 1-to-1 split. So at the end of this debate, I picked up op, which I thought primarily came down to the debate between primary and secondary boycotts. So what happens when secondary boycotts are allowed, and then who is impacted by this? And so government gov says that they'll lead to more union membership and power because you can do secondary boycotts now, but op says that secondary boycotts don't change industry standards and end up harming more people through small business impacts. So I bought the analysis from op more, saying things like if you boycott out Amazon, it's a lot easier for them to change suppliers than it is for them to change the labor standards, meaning that even if you allow secondary boycotts, you ultimately don't affect the type of big picture change that are important for impacting quality of life and all of the impacts that Gov wants to claim. And then there was a trade-off between primary and secondary benefits that was raised in the LOC that I don't think really came up as much in the MT, which is the idea that primary and secondary boycotts are exclusive. And so Gov is just like, well, these can happen together. So we just want to boost union membership. And I bought the op answer that while boycotts aren't necessarily finite, the resources behind them are. So this is why the trade-off exists, which is the warrant for how that comes about. And so ultimately the impact of harming the economy through the small businesses when the secondary boycotts are impacted was an offense that I thought was standing more at the end of the debate. And then a quick note on, there was a debate that came out later regarding whether union membership is increasing or decreasing in the status quo. I think both teams just disagreed about this, and it was more about tossing out sources than like backing up why that might be true. So I didn't factor it into my decision. Yeah, that's my brief overview for why I voted for op.
All right, so I voted for Gov. I think it was a close round, so I definitely understand where Alexandra is coming from. For me, I think a major mistake that the opposition team makes is that it doesn't really respond, or at least I wasn't able to hear any response to an argument that's made by the member of government who says that unions know what they're doing, and if secondary boycotts don't, like if there's a particular secondary boycott that's ineffective, then unions wouldn't do that one. They would do the ones that are effective. And that's extended in the affirmative rebuttal. And so I think that functionally takes out the second disadvantage. I think that the negative has some amount of access to the first disadvantage, talking about small businesses. It's a little bit unclear to me how the time frame on that debate works. It seems to be set up as a brink argument about whether or not we push the economy over the brink. And I'm not entirely sure at what point most of those boycotts of small businesses would happen. The affirmative seems to be saying that it would happen later once the unionization rate really picks up steam. The negative says, no, it will happen right away. I don't really see either side really warranting that out. So this one is a little bit of a wash for me. I'm not entirely sure whether that impact happens. I think that the government definitely does win that with secondary boycotts, unions would be able to get more power. I think that they access that through like workers seeing those boycotts and thinking, oh, if these people are boycotting and being active in the union, why can't I as well? I think that's a pretty clear link. I think they win a bunch of other links as well, but that one's probably enough. So at that point, I'm trying to weigh whether or not small businesses are, the impacts to small businesses are more important than the impacts to workers who are in unions. I think the opposition tries to do two sorts of weighing, neither ones of which work. The opposition says that their impacts concern the entire economy, and that's why they outweigh. I wasn't sure what particular impact that refers to, because obviously like small businesses are not the entire economy. So I wasn't sure if that was supposed to be weighing the small businesses impact or something else, but I just never saw a clear link chain to how they affect the entire economy. And the second argument that they try to go for is, what about the harm to non-union members who can't access the benefits because of all these really high union dues? I think the government takes that out pretty effectively by saying the union dues are A, super low, and B, optional. So at that point, I think the government is winning that we're improving unions and unions are good for workers' livelihoods. So at that point, I have to ask myself, do I care more about small businesses or do I care more about union workers? And there is just no weighing done in either rebuttal by either team that I can use here, which I think is a problem because that's the fundamental conflict in the round. So at that point, I have to end up doing work for one of the teams, and I end up doing work for the government because they did do weighing in their framework. They said that net benefits should be evaluated primarily as whether something benefits workers, because the majority of the population are workers. It seems like small business owners are not a majority of the population. So I guess I should care about workers more. I don't understand why the government didn't extend that and use that to outweigh the rest of the case. But also the negative didn't really respond to that one. So that's the only available weighing argument that I can find on my flow anywhere. And if either side addressed it, it would have probably resulted in higher speaker points for that side. But that's why I ended up voting for Gov. Does anyone have any questions for me or Alexandra?
I think that sounds good. So thanks for judging, and good luck to the other team too tonight and the rest of the weekend.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Good luck, you guys.